Hey, well, welcome to this ICONS New Scholarship podcast. My name is Rehan Abiratna. I'm a co-chair of the ICONS Committee on New Directions and Scholarship. My day job, I'm a professor and associate dean at the Western Sydney University School of Law. So we're starting a new format today where we feature not just a new book in public law, but we do so in the context of the career and past work of a leading scholar in the field. That scholar will be well known to listeners. It's Tom Ginsberg, who is the Leo Spitz Distinguished Service Professor of International Law, the Ludwig and Hilda Wolf Research Scholar, Professor of Political Science, Faculty Director of the Malyi Center for the Study of Institutional and Legal Integrity, and the Faculty Director of the Forum for Free Inquiry and Expression at the University of Chicago. Tom has published many important works in comparative constitutionalism. I'll just list a couple of my favorites, which include Judicial Review in New Democracies, Constitutional Courts in East Asia, which was published by Cambridge University Press in 2003, and Rule by Law, The Politics of Courts and Authoritarian Regimes, also published by Cambridge in 2008. So Tom has a terrific and important new book out, co-edited with Aziz Haq and Tarun Kaitan, entitled The Entrenchment of Democracy, The Comparative Constitutional Design of Elections, Parties, and Voting, which was published open access a few months ago. So you can actually download it for free at the Cambridge University Press website. So Tom, thanks very much for doing this. Before we dive into the book, I'd like to ask you to reflect a little bit on the state of the field today. So that's, I guess, the field of comparative public law, or I guess to be a little broader, maybe the field of comparative constitutionalism, and maybe a little bit about how it's evolved over the course of your career. So over to you. Thank you.
Wow. Okay, that's a great question. Thanks for having me on, Rehan, and thanks for doing this for ICON. The the field has changed completely from when I started as a graduate student, now over 30 years ago. At that time, comparative public law was basically there was EU law, but even that was still in its very nascent stage. Weiler had recently published The Transformation of Europe. Very little on Asia, some from political science, but it was not a huge field at all. And now you think about it, it's enormously successful and dynamic field. We have multiple journals that are filled with interesting and detailed scholarship. We have multiple generations of scholars producing all kinds of stuff. There's just further and further inquiry into all kinds of questions, all kinds of regions. We've expanded surely beyond Europe and beyond individual case studies to do truly comparative work. There's a lot of course, large N work, but there's also just new questions being asked all the time. So I think it's an incredibly vibrant field. And partly I think that has to do with just the questions being interesting and having been important in the world, right? The world has changed to make constitutional democracy, much more important. But there were also sort of developments in the social sciences that led to that. I've written a little bit about this, the shift towards institutionalism
Mm.
in social science. And of course, constitutions are a central institution. They're kind of a meta institution, you might say. And so I think that scholarly development overlapped with the third wave of democratization to produce an explosion of work. Now, the other thing I would say about it is that we have these multiple journals and we have ICON. We have these societies and meetings where, very large meetings, where there's just a really rich array of things going on. So I couldn't be happier with how it's all developed. The only problem, and you might face this too, is there's so much coming out, it's very hard to stay up on it all. There's just a lot of great work, and keeping up even on the journals in our field is almost impossible.
No, that's right. And I think one of the ways in which it's changed, and you've touched upon this, is that it's become so much more interdisciplinary. So one has to read not just sort of pure law stuff anymore, but much more sort of political science and historical inflected stuff, which leads me to my next question, because you're an interdisciplinary person. And I think you're one of the people who's driven comparative constitutional law to become comparative constitutionalism, right? Where we're sort of interested in broader questions. So can you say a little bit about how your scholarship has evolved as the field has evolved, and maybe some of the things driving that evolution within your own work?
Okay, yeah, that's good. I mean, I started out as a interdisciplinary scholar. I did a law degree and a PhD at the same time, but I only started doing law because I was interested in social science questions about law. I was interested in where constitutions come from, being someone who was young at the end of the Cold War and watching what was happening. A mystery. Where does constitutional democracy come from? How's it sustained? What are its weak spots? And of course, as the time has gone on, I've shifted more to the study of autocracy and democratic backsliding. Because I work on East Asia, that's my part of the world. I was always interested in autocracy, right? It's always very central. You know, there's always China, and as a historian or a student of Japan, I was always interested in Meiji Japan, which is a very interesting case of a constitutional system, constitutional monarchy, clearly authoritarian all the way through, and yet there were real restraints and real institutions. So that constitution was doing something, I would argue. And so I've tried to explore issues of authoritarianism all along. And then, of course, when Trump was elected, Aziz Huck and I wrote the book on democratic backsliding, how to save a constitutional democracy, because that was obviously a salient issue, which I wish was in the remainder bin for being irrelevant. But unfortunately, every day as we are talking in late March 2025, there's something new, which is a sign of just the major challenge to our constitutional democracy and very active questions of whether it'll survive or in what form. So anyway, the world has changed, and I think in terms of method, I've always been very open to different methods. You know, my dissertation, which was the book on judicial review, uses some very basic statistical methods. I've never been a great master of that, but I've always wanted to use that method of understanding what's going on in the world. And I've always combined it with case studies. So in that sense, I was always a mixed method scholar, as we call it in political science, which I think now everyone wants to do, and it's a healthy way to do things. I would say one last thing in terms of method, having spent time living in Asia and living in countries which might have the same formal architecture as others, but you know that they operate very differently. I've gone back to some very early interest of mine, and that's the work on Buddhism, and Buddhism and how it's informed comparative constitutional law in East Asian jurisdictions, or informed constitutional law in East Asian jurisdictions. So that requires almost a really totally different approach. It's almost like ethnography, or trying to understand the deep political theology of societies which might have modern constitutions, but they function very different logics. Thailand, where I used to live, would be one good example. And that's yet another method I'm kind of playing with. So I just keep moving.
Terrific. Thank you. I was going to say the Thailand chapter of that book is one of my favorites, Kem Tong's chapter. And it actually taught me a lot about Buddhism, which I wasn't expecting to get out of that. And I was like, oh yeah. And there's some very interesting
Yeah.
connections with Dharma Raja and all of that. But that's for another day. Can we turn to
Yes.
your new book on the entrenchment of democracy? Can you say a little bit first about kind of how you got to that project, and then we can sort of maybe talk about the book itself. But what was driving you and your co-editors to produce this book?
Yeah, maybe. So maybe first make a general point about edited volumes, because
Sure.
our mentor and teacher Joe Weiler has sometimes come out and said, "Oh, edited volumes are a waste of time." His advice to a young scholar: "Don't do them." I have had the opposite point of view. I sometimes use chapters in other people's edited volumes to begin to develop ideas, and especially now with the internet, like the placement doesn't actually matter very much, right? It's all out there, so you want to get it out there. And I think the dislike of edited volumes, I think, is misplaced more now than ever. But the other thing I would say is I've tried to use the editorial function sometimes to establish or to start lines of inquiry, which I could never do on my own. I couldn't have done a complete look at constitutions and authoritarian regimes just with one person. So it's a way of like getting a collective input in what's always a collective project. Scholarship's always a collective project, and understanding is, mutually, it requires a lot of friends to do it. And so I don't think all my edited books do this by any means, but some of them try to start fields, and do so by inviting a really disparate set of scholars. including the Buddhism book, which we were talking about before. This, I don't know if I would say that this has that great ambition, but it's a book that the actual genesis is that Tarun Kaitan was visiting Chicago, and Aziz and I, we do a lot together and we think a lot together. We're like, oh, what could we do with Tarun? Well, he's here. So let's put together a conference on issues of democracy and parties, because there actually is relatively little out there on it. It's such a core function that we think of. The entrenchment function has to set rules for politics. We all know that. But, compared to the amount of scholarship on judicial review or something like that, there's really very little on parties voting in democracy. And so we thought, well, we really should do this. And we invited a bunch of different scholars, people who had worked from all kinds of disciplines. So, you have Sakharov and Pildes, who of course have done fundamental work, Roz and David Landau, and then some piece by Adam Ababa on Africa. Yasmin Dawood talks about, she's working on it from a theoretical perspective about the value of a constitutionalized right to vote. I won't go through all the chapters, but it's just a really diverse array of scholars, just kind of approaching the problem from a multiple array of angles to try to make a little progress on it. And I suppose one thing that I came away from is that, there really is a lot more to do in this area. There's a lot more to do in this area. There's some fundamental questions in the literature which I think bear reevaluation as circumstances are changing, and I hope this will at least provide some way to think about that.
Yeah, and I think the book is very much framed in a spirit of inquiry, right? It's more about kind of asking the right questions about the role of parties in constitutional democracies rather than kind of prescribing too much. But, since we're here, maybe you could give us a couple of big takeaways that you got from these various chapters and your work with your co-editors.
Yeah, well, I mean, one thing is, so when we think about the regulation of parties, in general, of course, there's a historical and path-dependent structure to all of this. And, we have if you think about waves of constitutionalism and the ways in which constitutions were written, we've had very different approaches over the centuries to the question of how you prevent what we call lockups, or Pildes and Sakharov call partisan lockups, or just the capture of the machinery of government by a leader, by anyone, by the political players. Constitutions are supposed to be the rules of the game. The players are supposed to act within those rules. But since those players are, first of all, shaped by those rules, we know that party systems evolve, with constitutional structures, and you change the constitutional structure, the party system will change. But there's also, of course, the incentives that parties have to take over and to escalate and manipulate those rules for their own benefit. And so that's just been an enduring problem in thinking about constitutional design. And it's a real puzzle when you state it that way because of the endogeneity of it all. And early constitutions like that of the United States didn't say anything about parties, aren't even mentioned. The whole thing is designed to avoid faction, as Madison put it. And I think the way that he thought about, preventing capture was, let ambition be set against ambition, checks and balances, divide power, extend the republic, all that stuff was a kind of structural way of getting at it. And that's sort of the first era, or the first set of ideas around that. Parties begin to make their appearance in constitutions in the late 19th century. Really, if you look back even at the end of the 19th century, not many mentioned parties. Now they all do. And part of that change has been because of the militant democracy idea, right? That, obviously it comes from Lowenstein and the experience of fascism. Actually, it's important to remember Lowenstein wrote those articles before, he was basing his data on the interwar constitutions of, Europe. And so there was already some experimentation with that. But then obviously whatever experimentation there was insufficient to stop fascism. So then we get into this big question, wow, we have a paradox of democracy. We can't let the undemocratic parties compete, and we need to block them out somehow. And so That set of ideas was, of course, very popular. Now, fast forward to where we are. I mean, I think there's beginning to be a sense that, well, maybe that's not the solution to all in all times and places, because those mechanisms are, of course, themselves subject to abuse. And, we see obviously backsliding democracies and populists and such like to use those rules to lock the thing up for themselves. So we need a new set of answers, right? And I think we don't provide them here. I think about Dixon and Landau's work. I think there's kind of a kind of eclectic mix of mechanisms that people are now thinking about. Some of them militant democracy type of tools, but not explicitly so. A lot of structural remedies, a lot of fourth branch stuff, and all of that together is trying to solve the enduring problem of constitutional democracy, which is how do you prevent the players from taking over the rules of the game. So that's kind of a summary of where we are on it. And I hope, we obviously need a lot more thinking about it. Tarun, in his own work, has done a couple of imaginative, proposals for constitutional design that would be more responsive and such. I think in our book, we have grappled with all kinds of mechanisms, but there's not, we don't have some magic bullet answer. I think it's like a good place to kind of go and figure out what's the state of play, what's happened. Mila Versteeg and I have a chapter in there on the trends in constitutionalization of democracy, how that has changed over time and what's in there, what's not. And clearly we are seeing more and more attention to these issues in constitutions, but the problem is just always an enduring one. I mean, I think that's just the nature of what we do. Constitutions are designed to solve yesterday's problem, and then there's new ones that arise, and we need to amend and tweak and such. So I think that's sort of where this fits into our moment. Let me put it that way.
Oh, that's terrific. And could I ask you to say maybe a little bit more about the role of parties specifically with democratic backsliding? Because one of the things that I appreciated about the book and your introductory chapter is to reframe that discussion a little bit, because often when we talk about authoritarian populism or democratic backsliding, the focus tends to be on individual leaders. So whether it's Bolsonaro or Trump or Duterte. And what you guys do very nicely is to say, actually, they're sort of embedded in this party structure. And both the kind of politics of those parties and the constitutional rules around those parties make a difference. So I just invite you to say a little bit more about that, because I thought that was a really nice
Yeah.
intervention.
Yeah, I mean, well, first of all, there's a couple of different things going on. First of all, there's the Kim Shepley has a piece a few years ago where she says it's called "The Party's Over,"
Yes.
and recognizes that one of the problems that we're in is that parties have become actually very weak, and they become these vehicles for takeover by strongmen or populists or whatever who, and they're not able to constrain them. And that's a huge problem in terms of the governance over time, because an individual leader has a limited political time horizon of their lifetime. A party, a well-functioning party, has a one of decades certainly, and maybe even centuries if you're like the Chinese Communist Party or something like that. You're not thinking in terms of next year, and so parties are super important for that structure, but and they are generally weakening. And the other way to think about it is that in a well-functioning democracy, you have parties that are engaged in bargaining within this game framework, and there may be other reasons why there's been breakdowns in equilibria, in terms of the competition between the parties, that one needs to escalate the rules and move to the constitutional level and try to capture. Like, that's what we're really seeing in the United States, that whatever norms constrain parties begin to really break down. And we saw, I would say, a critical moment was McConnell's decision not to allow Merrick Garland's nomination to go forward, because that's basically, okay, we're going to change the rules just now, and that's going to turn the presidential election into a referendum on the Supreme Court. Donald Trump gets elected, we're off and running. So party cooperation with each other, even though they're in competition, is kind of an interesting phenomenon that goes to this. By the way, another theme is that, it's not so much brought out in our volume, but in the study of parties, is that parties are, in some sense, micro democracies, because within parties you have
Mm.
competition for being
Mhm.
the leader, and those are, can be vicious fights, but at the end they have to come together in order to cooperate to compete with the other folks, and so they're microcosms of competition within a cooperative framework. And I don't think we talk much about that, but that's in a way exactly what we want out of the system as a whole. It's just that in our polarized era, especially with what we call effective polarization, where you just hate the other party just because you hate them, you don't even care what they stand for. It's really hard to get that kind of cooperative equilibrium. So something's pretty broken. At least I can't help but be thinking, obviously, this week about the United States and what's going on. But it's a more general phenomenon for sure.
Yeah, oh, terrific. Can we move on to talk a little bit about the process of putting the book together? And just ask you what you found most rewarding about it. I mean, you said, and I totally agree with you, that doing edited volumes is immensely rewarding in itself. But if there's something more about this volume in particular that you enjoyed, and then maybe something that you found challenging about this topic or about this book.
Okay, that's a great question. I mean, you've done it. It's a rewarding thing, which sometimes the external powers that be don't recognize how valuable it is. So I think it's an underappreciated thing, but it is very satisfying because you're working with a whole bunch of authors that you get to pick, that you get to work with, and you get to go back and forth and critique their work and such. And so, in general, like Aziz and I think it's our probably a third book together, third edited book, and we've written a book. We've written a bunch of articles. I was joking with him. We probably, our joint work probably would be a 10-yearable file somewhere. There's the things we've done together, and we just, I really just love working with him because we go to the University of Chicago is kind of a weird place. We go to lunch together almost every day. We walk to the faculty club, and he and I, when we, are walking back, we'll have, several ideas. And my only problem is I don't write as fast as him, and so I'm always behind. I'm always feeling guilty and behind. So anyway, that's just part of our long collaboration, and I think that's obviously a true joy for me to get to work with him. And then having Tarun around was just a treat. He's a fantastic scholar and really a creative thinker. So that was all to the good. I mean, the joy of it. And also because I have running this thing called the Mali Institute, I was able to get funds very easily for open access, which is good. A lot of times, certainly I'll just say a little bit about that. When open access first
Sure.
came out, people like me were like, "Whoa, we shouldn't do this. We shouldn't do it because it means the traditional, you know, you're somehow buying, access or anything like that." But I also edit this series at Cambridge, and the press really likes it. And I think at the end of the day, what do we want? We want our work to be read. And some topics are of broad appeal outside even the academy. And so open access is really good for that. So I've become kind of a fan of it, even though it is very pricey. You need to find funds for it. So, and edited volumes are always expensive anyway, because you have to have a conference and you need your dean to support you. So,
Yep.
but maybe the marginal cost of the open access now might be relatively low compared to the rest of that. So, all right, that was all the good stuff. Now you said, what about challenges? Boy, that's interesting. Probably just the general challenge of all the other things we were doing. I think we got this out very quickly, though. It came out last year at the very end of 2024, and Tony had visited the previous year, so I think it's certainly maybe less than 2 years from the conference to the finish. We're pretty fast, but that's always a little bit of a frustration, just that lag. The press takes a while to put things together. I think if I could do it again, I might change some of the. You know, it's always ideal when you're doing one of these edited volumes to really try to get people as much as possible in a common framework and to really tackle problems. But I suppose that's inevitable. I now feel like, having done it, I have these new questions, some of which I was laying out for you, and I would probably organize it around those new questions, having done this one. But that's always also the nature of scholarship. You're never quite done, and you're never quite happy with what you've done. It's the nature of it.
To me, that just means you need to do volume two in a couple of years, maybe with a
Yes.
different set of contributors. So that just actually leads me to my final question, Tom, which is now you're done with this volume. I know you have many different things going on, but maybe tell us about a couple of things you're working on now. What's next?
Well, first of all, running now, the university president asked me to start an organization on free academic freedom and free expression. So that's been really interesting for me. In fact, I taught a comparative free expression class last term, which was great for me. Reading all the people who work in this, Adrian Stone, and
Yep.
a bunch of European scholars, a lot of great stuff out there. And so that was learning experience. But I'm doing a lot in the university context on institutional neutrality, as we call it here in the United States, which is the idea that the university is not a political actor. I think that's more normal outside the U.S., but in the U.S. we have universities and departments that want to, make all kinds of statements about X or Y, and these are really sort of corporate style virtue signals, in my view. I think we should change the world with our scholarship. That's a very old romantic idea, but I think it's what we have to offer is that we speak through our work and we speak through the activities the university does. So welcoming scholars who are, from places at risk and things like that. That's what's important to me. So I have a book on that. I am working on a large project on international organization charters, which I view as kind of constitutions for international organizations. And I've been doing that for a couple of years. I have a National Science Foundation grant, and it's been slow to come, but I think certainly have a couple papers on that this summer. And then I have a long gestating book on term limit violations
Mm.
and term limits and in constitutions. And that particular one, which I will do with Zach Elkins, is I really want to get out soon because we might have a challenge in 4 years in the United States. It might be a very live issue. So I need to get the analysis out there, about the determinants of who violates, what they can do, and, are there there's obviously some designs that can improve things. So those are some of the projects I'm working on. Unfortunately, I'm doing a lot of administration, so I don't get to write very much.
Fair
Young
enough. Just
people listening to this, yeah, I just want to say, like, if you're a graduate student and you feel like really put upon, I look back at when I was a graduate student, I realized, God, that was the time I could read the most.
yep.
And I actually probably had the most writing time, even though I wasn't as good a writer. So there's like that trade-off. But it is important to read while you can, because time gets really scarce.
I think that's a good note to end on. Tom, thank you so much for doing this. This is really insightful, not just about the book, but sort of the broader stuff you've been working on for so long. So thanks again. Really appreciate it.
Thank, thank you so much, Rayhan, and congrats on the podcast.
Thank you.